So it's really easy to beat ourselves up over our bad behaviors and the negative outcomes that those behaviors cause. We beat ourselves up over things like our financial issues, our health issues, not being as productive as we'd like to be. And a lot of the times we take those bad behaviors and negative outcomes to mean something about ourselves. Take me, for example. When I'm not as productive as I'd like to be, or I don't get as many things done as I'd wish to, I say things to myself like, you're lazy, you're unmotivated, you just don't want it bad enough, you just flat out suck. And I don't know if you guys have done things like this to yourself before, but what I've come to realize is that my bad behaviors and the negative outcomes that those things lead to have much more to do with how I go about doing those things and the environment that I do them in than it actually has to do about something with me intrinsically. So in this video, I'm gonna make the argument that your bad behaviors and their negative outcomes have much less to do with your internal character flaws than they actually have to do with your design flaws of how you go about setting up to do behaviors and the actual things that you're seeking to get out of them. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So in this video, we're gonna cover 3 broad ideas. I'm gonna talk about why it's not your fault. I'm gonna talk about troubleshooting the bad behaviors that you wanna fix. And then lastly, we're gonna talk about shaping the path for optimal performance. Get things kicked off, I wanna talk about number 1, it's not your fault. We're gonna talk about 2 things. We're gonna talk about drug abuse and we're gonna talk about Stanford. And not that they have anything in common with one another, but because I've learned really interesting insights about both of these concepts that can really help you shape and change the behaviors that you do on a regular basis. So first and foremost, let's talk about drug abuse and what we've learned from that. I want you to imagine it's the 1970s, the Vietnam War is going on, and 2 US congressmen head over to Vietnam to check on the troops. And what they find is terrifying. They saw that over 20% of US troops were addicted to heroin, and something like 40+% of them have used heroin in the last 6 to 12 months. So these US congressmen come home and they're like, holy smokes, we've got a big issue. We're gonna have all these drug users coming home back to US soil. We gotta figure out something to do. And so they started tracking these US soldiers as they started coming home, and what they found was astonishing. What they found was that when they got home, only something like 5% of the US troops who had been addicted or using heroin ended up continuing using heroin. And that's so astonishing because something like 95% of heroin users have a re-addiction rate in the US, meaning that of the people who use heroin, 95% of them continue to use heroin. So there's a stark difference between the 5% of US soldiers who were addicted that came back versus the 95% normal attrition rate of people who stay addicted. And so that leads to a much bigger question that the researchers were trying to chew on. Why was it that so many people were addicted in Vietnam and came home and didn't end up continue using heroin? And so what they found were 3 pretty convincing arguments. First and foremost, they were in a really stressful environment in Vietnam. They're in a war-torn country, and the stress of that led them to cope with things like drugs and alcohol. Secondly, it was really accessible and available. It was really easy to get heroin because a lot of people were using it. And then lastly, contextually, it was socially acceptable. A lot of people were using heroin, the locals were using it, the troops were using it, and it wasn't, faux pas or like poo-pooed on to be using heroin. So that was a culmination of things that led them to actually using heroin. And what the researchers kind of figured out looking at this case study was 2 different things. One, a big change in your environment can have a radical change on your behavior. Just leaving that place of Vietnam and coming home, changing the environment that you're in where heroin was no longer accessible, it wasn't acceptable socially, and you weren't in the stress of a war-torn country, completely changed the behaviors that you were doing. And then secondly, behavior is extremely contextual. We do a lot of the behaviors that we follow through on a regular basis, widely because of the environment that we're in and the people that we have around us. And when we change that environment, we can change the behaviors that we actually follow through on. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating and definitely worth sharing. So we just learned about how the environment shapes our behavior. The next thing I want to talk about is Stanford. And you guys have heard me talk about BJ Fogg before. He's a researcher, teacher there, professor there. He leads the behavior design lab, and his students have gone on to create products like Instagram, right? So he's a big deal. He knows a lot about the way we engage in behaviors and why we do what we do. Well, he goes on to tell us that another flaw that we have with behaviors that leads to a design flaw versus an actual character flaw is that a lot of us depend on motivation when we're building our habits. It comes around every time January 1st, right? You set out on wanting to build a new workout routine or getting healthier eating habits, and you have this really big motivation high. BJ calls this the motivation monkey. The motivation monkey is there, and we do things for a little bit. But once that motivation monkey leaves or that motivation internally dips, we end up quitting our behavior altogether. And he says we've got things completely wrong. We need to stop making motivation the crux of our behaviors and our long-term outcomes and start focusing on the other things that actually go into building a behavior. Those things include our ability to perform a behavior and the cue or prompt that notifies us of actually doing the behavior. He explains the motivation monkey like this. I don't know, I'll give you guys a personal example. I watched this documentary called Forks Over Knives, and in it I'm like, yes, heck yeah, I need to become a vegan, or I need to start eating more plant-based foods. I'm gonna change my diet tomorrow. And that high lasted for a little bit of time. I was really amped up and motivated to do that. But once the high left, I was left with absolutely no tools or resources to be able to continue making good choices now that the motivation was gone. And so BJ tells us we need to reframe the way we think about behaviors. We need to create behaviors where we need to be at our lowest motivation and still follow through with them versus capitalizing on peak motivation to actually follow through. So we need to do things like solidify a prompt, and we need to do things like make the ability as easy as possible. And I'm gonna explain examples of those, but what we need to keep in mind is that we can't base our behaviors just on motivation, right? If you only do things when you're motivated because you're flat broke and need to save some money, or your health is absolutely out of control and you need to start making better choices, eventually those choices will vanish when you don't have other supporting structures that keep them going. So the point I want to drive home here is that motivation is not the cure-all, and there's other things we need to focus on when we're troubleshooting our behaviors to make sure that they stick. All right, so bright idea number 2 is troubleshooting our behaviors. We just talked about how if you want to change something, you can't rely on motivation, because when motivation leaves, you're left with absolutely nothing to follow through on. So in the FOG behavior model, B equals MAP, we know that behaviors equal motivation times ability times prompt. I just burped, I'm sorry. So with that being said, BJ tells us that the troubleshooted behavior, we need to start in the least likely place. A lot of us start with motivation. We try and increase motivation to get more stuff done. What we actually need to do is start with the prompt and then go to ability. So what is a prompt? A prompt is a cue that notifies us of performing a behavior. For example, your phone dings and then you go to pick it up. The cue is the ding of the phone. Or let's say, what's another prompt? You leave your meditation cushion in the middle of the floor, and every time you walk on it or past it, it reminds you that you maybe should be meditating or to meditate. You set reminders on your phone. Have you ever noticed that all the couches in your house point towards the TV? That's a prompt to be looking or watching TV. So the first place we need to start structuring good behaviors is what is the prompt that's cueing us to do a certain thing. In Vietnam, it might have been other soldiers who were using heroin or other drugs that prompted you to also say, maybe I should be using, or to actually start using myself. In our own lives, we talk about, how can we set up a prompt to remind us to floss? Well, you put the flossers right next to the toothbrush, and when you're done toothbrushing, you can just pick up the floss and get to work. So my question for you is, when you're troubleshooting behaviors that you're having a hard time following through on, what is the prompt that you're using to notify yourself that you need to do that thing? We talk a lot about piggybacking or anchoring, where you're building other habits on top of pre-existing behaviors that you already do. Like every day you make coffee. Well, maybe you build a meditation habit on top of every time you make coffee. Or every time you eat, you say 3 things you're grateful for. You can see how that escalates. The second thing we need to keep in mind is, how can we make the ability super, super easy where we can't not do it? We talked about the motivation monkey is super peak, but when that motivation monkey is gone, we need to be able to follow through on that habit behavior when we absolutely don't want to. And the way we do that is by making it as easy as possible. When you're super motivated, you may be able to bang out 100 push-ups, but when you have absolutely no motivation, starting with 1 push-up is the key. So let's take a personal example for me. I'm hopped up on Forks Over Knives. I want to start eating healthier. Instead of being vegan the next day and expecting that to continue forever, what I did was I put a reminder on my phone that every time at lunch I would eat 1 vegetable, and that I'd stock my fridge with vegetables so that even if I was just 1 stalk of broccoli or some Brussels sprouts, I was eating a vegetable every single day at lunch. And then that continued to compound time over time, where I started adding more and more when I started getting more and more results, more and more motivated. But you guys get the picture, right? You need to lower the ability to the point where it's so easy you can't not do it. And that's how you troubleshoot behaviors. You don't start with motivation. Motivation is the last thing you try and tweak. You start with having a good prompt and making the ability super easy for you to follow through on to support you even when the motivation's gone. All right, you guys, so bright idea number 3 is shaping the path. In the 2 previous bright ideas, we talked a ton about how important our environment is in shaping good behaviors, and also how important it is to not rely so much on motivation and willpower, but to support good habits by designing them with prompts, cues, and increased ability to actually execute something. In this bright idea, I want to talk about how we can actually use choice architecture to shape our environment and make better decisions. And the best way I can think about explaining this to you is by describing a research article that I read that a group of Harvard scientists conducted at Mass Gen in Boston. And so what they did was they wanted to figure out a way to increase better health choices by participants in a cafeteria. And so they thought that they could help increase healthy choices by getting more people to drink water. So how did they go about doing this? Well, they went to the cafeteria and they saw that they had a couple refrigerators surrounding the perimeter of the cafeteria, but a really high concentration of them right next to the cash registers. And right next to the cash registers, these refrigerators were stocked with tons of sugary drinks like soda and fruit juices that a lot of people tended to buy. And so what they thought is, how can we actually increase the amount of water people are buying without changing the amount of pop or other sugary drinks that are available in the refrigerators? So they stocked all the refrigerators next to the cash registers with tons of water, and they didn't change anything else. And then they just observed. And what they found was pretty astonishing. They found that sales of water actually went up 26%, and sales of pop and other sugary drinks actually went down 10%. And keep in mind, they didn't do anything to actually decrease the amount of availability to pop. They just increased the amount of availability to water. And just doing that alone made more people buy water because it was more accessible. And when they interviewed these people, the people had no idea. It wasn't because it was more available. They just said, well, I wanted to drink water, or I felt like water was probably a good choice then, or I just didn't really want pop at that time. And so simply by introducing people to more choices or different choices, it changed their behavior without even them knowing. And marketing professionals and people who work in supermarkets and stores have a massive grasp on this. If you ever notice, the best-selling stuff is always at the end caps, or the most high-producing margin products are always at eye level because you want to grab that stuff, it's easier to see, and the choices that are presented with you increase or actually dictate the behaviors that you end up following through on. So how can we change this in our lives? How can we use this kind of choice architecture in our own lives? Well, the whole point of shaping the path is by putting things in your environment or removing things in your environment that are not serving your behaviors. Is it any wonder that you spend so much time on your phone? I'm practically addicted to my phone, and it's because our phones are really, really great. Phones are fun. Same thing with alcohol or watching TV or binge watching Netflix, right? Those things are really fun. Is it any wonder that we do those things instead of doing our work or doing the things that we know we should be doing? No, of course not. What we need to stop looking at it is like a character flaw that we want to do those things. Those things are addictive and they're tons of fun. What we need to get better at is designing our environment to make those things much harder to do so that we choose the thing that we know we should be doing. So when we talk about choice architecture or designing our environment, I talk about things like this. Personal examples I can share with you are putting things in the fridge that I know I should be eating and taking everything else out of the house that I know I don't want to be eating. BJ Fogg talks about him and his partner, Denny, created this really funny fridge where all they stock it full is tons of healthy foods. So when they get a hankering for something, the easy to eat foods and the healthy foods are already available in their fridge, and they don't keep any of the junk food in the house. If you want to cut down on the amount of time that you're actually watching TV, try unplugging the TV and stowing it in another bedroom or putting it in the closet so that if you want to actually watch TV, it's a lot harder to do. Choice architecture is all about designing behaviors or making bad behaviors harder to do and easy behaviors really easy to do. Let's say you want to meditate more, throw your meditation cushion in the middle of your floor, and every time you walk over it, make a pact with yourself that you'll sit down and take 10 deep breaths or something like that. So you can see how the choice architecture and really designing our environment is crucial to making sure that we make good decisions and choices. It's not so much that you're not capable, it's really easy to be addicted or distracted by other things. We need to counteract that by putting things in our environment that promote good behaviors and detract from bad behaviors. So in sum, the argument that I want to make is that it's not a character flaw, it's a design flaw that you have bad behaviors and the negative outcomes associated with that. And we can counteract those things by making sure we design our environments and design good habits to be promoted, and we can design bad habits to be promoted against. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you took something away from it. Let me know what you thought down in the comments, and if not, I'll talk to you guys soon.